What would you do if you woke up one morning to find your family's legacy being ripped apart, tree by tree, with no warning and no mercy? I woke to the sound of chainsaws, not the distant hum of a neighbor trimming hedges, but the deep, guttural roar of something much worse. The kind of sound that punches through your gut before your brain even registers what's happening. Still half asleep, I jolted upright, my heart already hammering, a sick feeling twisting in my stomach. For a split second, I thought I was dreaming. But then I looked out my window. And my world came crashing down. Men in neon vests swarmed my backyard like executioners, chainsaws raised, slashing through decades-old fruit trees as if they were nothing more than weeds. A massive apple tree, one that had stood on my family's land for over 50 years, groaned under the weight of its own destruction, its branches cracking like brittle bones before it toppled to the ground in a shower of splintered wood and crushed fruit. I was out of bed and down the stairs before my brain could even catch up. My feet barely touched the ground as I ripped open the back door, the smell of freshly cut wood hitting me in the face like an insult. My boots pounded against the earth as I ran, my heart hammering so loudly that it drowned out everything else, until I saw her. Karen. Standing dead center in the wreckage, arms crossed, eyes glinting with satisfaction, she looked like a queen surveying the spoils of war. Her lips curled into a smirk of absolute victory as another tree, my tree, hit the ground behind her. "Oh, good, you're awake," she said, as if she had simply taken out my garbage instead of razing my family's orchard to the ground. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The orchard was my family's legacy. My grandfather had planted some of these trees with his own hands. The apples from these branches had won state fairs. The peaches had been featured in magazines. The cherries had been praised by top chefs. This was more than land. It was history. Karen, however, saw something else. A nuisance. She lifted her chin, clearly pleased with herself. "You're welcome," she added, as if she had just done me a favor. I stared at her, my body shaking, not from fear, but from something far, far worse. The kind of rage that doesn't explode. The kind that sinks deep into your bones and waits. And in that moment, as another tree collapsed in a cloud of dust and splinters, I knew. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I took a step forward, fists clenched, every muscle in my body strung tight like a wire about to snap. "You had no right." The words came out hoarse, almost a whisper, but Karen just smiled, as if I were throwing a tantrum over something as trivial as a misplaced lawn ornament. "Oh, but I did," she said smoothly, lifting a neatly printed document between two fingers, waving it in the air like a prize. Section 5B of the HOA agreement clearly states that any landscaping deemed disruptive to the visual cohesion of the community is subject to removal. And wouldn't you know it? The board voted, and here we are. Her voice was calm, controlled, practiced. I knew that tone well. It was the same one she had used the very first time she knocked on my door, clipboard in hand, her smile stretched tight across her face like an ill-fitting mask. "Welcome to the neighborhood, Joe. Just a few things to go over about our HOA guidelines." That had been my first mistake, thinking she was just being neighborly. The second mistake was ignoring her. At first, it was minor things. A notice about my fence being too rustic. A warning about my garden gnome collection being excessive. A complaint about my mailbox not being in line with the others. Petty. Irritating. But nothing worth a fight. So I brushed them off, thinking if I ignored her long enough, she'd move on to someone else. But Karen didn't like to be ignored. The letters started showing up every few weeks. Anonymous complaints, except everyone knew exactly where they came from. The grass was too long. The trees were too wild. The orchard was unruly and unfit for the neighborhood aesthetic. I tossed the letters into a drawer and carried on with my life. Until one day, I walked outside and found Karen standing in my yard, uninvited, taking pictures of my trees. I had laughed then. What, was she going to file a report about a cherry tree offending her sensibilities? I even gave the oldest, largest apple tree a new name just to needle her, Old Karen. Word spread fast. The neighbors loved it, they were tired of her nonsense, too. People started joking about Old Karen whenever they passed my yard, chuckling under their breath, mocking her power trip. Karen, of course, didn't laugh. Instead, she doubled down. The fines escalated. First $50 for non-regulation plant life. Then $100 for excessive foliage. A week later, another fine for failure to comply with community landscaping policies. I ignored them all. I had better things to do than play along with her little dictatorship. Then one evening, as I stepped onto my porch, I saw her standing at the edge of my property, hands on her hips, glaring at Old Karen like it had personally insulted her. "That tree is an eyesore," she said flatly. I had smiled, slow and deliberate. "That tree," I replied, "is older than this entire HOA." She hadn't liked that response. And she definitely hadn't liked it when neighbors started calling the tree Old Karen, in casual conversation. That was when the real war began. The HOA fines became more aggressive. Notices were posted directly on my door instead of mailed. I even caught Karen snooping around with a tape measure, probably hoping to cite me for a non-compliant tree height. But I never thought she'd go this far. Never thought she'd take an axe, well, a chainsaw, to my property. And yet, here I stood, the smell of sawdust thick in the air, staring at the emptiness where my trees had once stood. My jaw clenched as I took another step forward, my breath steady, my voice cold. "This wasn't a vote," I said, voice sharp with quiet rage. "This was personal." Karen raised an eyebrow, completely unbothered. "You can file a complaint with the HOA board if you're unhappy with their decision," she said with a fake sympathetic tilt of her head. I laughed. The sound of it was dry, humorless. Because she was the board. And I had just realized exactly how far she was willing to go. But what Karen didn't know, what she was about to find out in the worst possible way, was that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The silence that followed was thick, the kind that presses down on you, suffocating in its weight. The chainsaws had gone quiet. The workers were packing up their gear, their boots crunching over fallen branches, over the shattered remains of my grandfather's legacy. I stood there, heart pounding, hands shaking, but not with fear, with pure, calculated fury. I turned back to Karen, who was still basking in her twisted sense of accomplishment. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." My voice was low, controlled, steady. The kind of steady that should have made her nervous. But Karen just rolled her eyes, waving the HOA document like it was a royal decree. "Oh, please," she scoffed. "You were warned. Your little forest was ruining the neighborhood aesthetic. Now, everything looks clean, uniform, proper." I let out a short, humorless laugh, shaking my head in disbelief. She still didn't get it. "You don't even realize what you've done, do you?" I said, tilting my head slightly, watching her reaction. She frowned, annoyed that I wasn't reacting how she expected. "I realize exactly what I've done. I've raised property values. Honestly, I don't know why you're so upset. It's just a bunch of trees. Just a bunch of trees." The weight of her words settled in my chest like a boulder, cold and immovable. These weren't just trees. They were living history, a connection to my father, my grandfather, to generations before me. The apple tree that had been planted the day I was born, the peach trees that had won blue ribbons at state fairs, the cherry tree that had survived storms, droughts, even a fire, all gone. I took a slow, deep breath. Losing my temper wouldn't bring them back. But ruining Karen? That was something I could do, ***. Before I could say another word, one of the workers, a man with a guilty look in his eyes, approached me. "Sir, we were just following HOA orders. We were told everything was approved." I turned back to Karen. "And you signed off on it personally, didn't you?" Karen smirked. "Of course I did. As HOA president, it's my responsibility to ensure compliance. And let's be real, Joe, you were never going to comply." She was so sure of herself. So sure that she had won. That I'd just roll over and accept it. Instead, I reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and snapped a picture of the wreckage. Karen barely reacted, too busy enjoying her victory. Then, still keeping my voice level, I said, ***, hope you have a good lawyer, ***. She scoffed, folding her arms. "Oh, don't be dramatic. You signed the HOA agreement when you moved in. It clearly states that any landscaping deemed disruptive can be removed at the board's discretion. This is completely legal." I smiled. But there was no warmth behind it. "Karen, you just authorized the destruction of an orchard that was under state evaluation for historical preservation status." The smirk faltered, just for a second. "You're lying." I shook my head. "Not at all. I submitted paperwork to the state agricultural department months ago. That cherry tree you had cut down? It was from one of the oldest documented lineages in this region, the apple trees. Some of the rarest heirloom varieties left in the country, and the peach trees. Let's just say they were worth a small fortune in their own right." Her expression flickered, an almost imperceptible crack in her confidence, but she recovered quickly, forcing a laugh. "Even if that's true, the HOA had every right." "No, you didn't," I interrupted, stepping closer. "That orchard was on private property. You had no legal right to order its removal without a formal hearing. Even if the HOA had concerns, this should have gone through a legal process. Instead, you skipped all of that and made an executive decision that's going to cost you." Karen's smug expression faltered again. "The board voted on it," she said, but there was less confidence in her voice now. I narrowed my eyes. "And I'll be requesting the meeting minutes from that vote. Let's see how official it really was." For the first time, Karen looked unsure. She opened her mouth, then snapped it shut, probably running through every excuse she could think of. I didn't give her the chance. "I hope you're ready for a lawsuit," I said calmly. "Because not only am I suing the HOA for destruction of property, but I'll also be pressing charges for trespassing, vandalism, and financial damages, and considering the value of those trees, I'd say you're in for a pretty hefty bill." The color drained from her face. "You're bluffing." I tapped my phone screen. "Already contacted my lawyer." Then, after a deliberate pause, I added, ***, and since local news loves a good HOA abuse story, I might just give them a call too, ***. Karen stiffened, her eyes darting toward the houses around us. Neighbors were watching, some had come outside, drawn by the noise. A few were whispering, shaking their heads as they looked at my destroyed orchard. Even the workers looked uneasy, probably realizing they'd just been roped into something much bigger than a landscaping job. I turned to the foreman, my tone cold and firm. "I suggest you document everything about who ordered this job. Because you're about to be dragged into a legal mess, and I doubt Karen here is going to take the fall alone." The man nodded quickly, stepping away from Karen, clearly wanting no part of what was coming. Karen's face was red now, her hands clenched into fists. "This isn't over," she snapped. I smiled. "Oh, I know. But the difference was, I was the one who was going to win." The courtroom was silent except for the steady ticking of the clock on the wall, each second stretching the tension tighter, winding it like a cord that was just waiting to snap. Karen sat stiffly at the defendant's table, her arms crossed so tightly it looked like she was trying to hold herself together. Gone was the smug smile, the overconfident posture she had worn while standing in the wreckage of my orchard. Now, she was pale, lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes darting between the judge, the opposing lawyer, and the handful of people in attendance. She wasn't in control anymore. And she knew it. I sat across from her, calm, collected, watching as my lawyer, David Harper, laid out our case with surgical precision. Every word drove the nails deeper into the coffin Karen had built for herself. Unauthorized destruction of private property. Violation of property rights. Financial damages. Breach of state preservation laws. Fraudulent HOA practices, ****. The list went on and on, each charge landing like a hammer blow. When David presented the expert evaluations, detailing the value of my orchard, the lost revenue from fruit sales, and the cultural significance of the trees that had been cut down, I caught the flicker of panic in Karen's eyes. But it wasn't until he mentioned that one of the trees had been under official review for historical recognition that her hands tightened into fists. She had thought she was just cutting down a few trees, she had no idea she was about to be financially ruined. The judge, an older man with sharp eyes and a slow, deliberate way of speaking, listened carefully, occasionally adjusting his glasses. When it was finally Karen's turn to defend herself, her lawyer, a frazzled man in an ill-fitting suit, cleared his throat and tried to spin the narrative. The HOA was simply acting in the best interest of the community, he began, his voice filled with forced confidence. The orchard was an eyesore. It lowered property values. The trees were not compliant with neighborhood regulations. And then it happened. Karen, unable to help herself, cut him off. "Your Honor, this is ridiculous," she snapped, her voice sharper than it should have been in a courtroom. This was about keeping the neighborhood uniform. He was being stubborn. "We did what needed to be done." The judge slowly lifted his gaze, his expression unreadable. "Did you say we, Mrs. Reynolds?" Karen blinked. The realization hit her, but it was too late. Her lawyer shot her a look that practically screamed, "Shut up," but she charged ahead anyway, already too deep in her own arrogance. "Well, yes," she continued, her voice a little less certain now. "As HOA president, I have the authority to approve these decisions." It was a necessary action. The judge leaned forward slightly, adjusting his glasses. "Did you consult a legal expert before authorizing the removal of the trees?" Karen hesitated. Then shook her head. The room was so quiet you could hear the hum of the air conditioning. The judge nodded, as if he had expected that answer. "Did you provide the homeowner with formal written notice before proceeding with the removal?" Another pause. Another shake of the head. The final nail came a second later. "And did you, at any point, verify whether these trees had any agricultural or historical significance before ordering their destruction?" Karen opened her mouth. Closed it again. Swallowed hard. She didn't have an answer, because she had never bothered to check. She had been so consumed with her need to win, her need to control, that she hadn't stopped to consider the consequences. The judge sighed, taking off his glasses and rubbing his temples before turning his attention back to David. "Continue." What followed was the slow, methodical dismantling of Karen's entire defense. Emails were brought forward, showing that Karen had intentionally forged neighborhood complaints about the orchard. Financial records proved she had used HOA funds to cover legal fees, violating association bylaws. And, perhaps most damning of all, an HOA board member, Rick Coleman had come forward with the real meeting minutes, exposing that no official vote had ever taken place. The weight of the evidence was crushing, and Karen knew it. By the time the judge delivered his ruling, she looked like she was going to be sick. The HOA was found guilty of overreach and property destruction. Karen, in her personal capacity as acting president, was held financially liable alongside the association. The damages awarded to me were astronomical, enough to not only compensate me for the loss of my orchard but to hit the HOA with the kind of fine that would take years to recover from. Karen's personal liability meant she was on the hook for a significant portion of it. She turned a shade of pale I didn't think was possible. When the judge adjourned court, she sat there, frozen, as people stood up around her, as the whispers spread through the room. She had lost everything. I walked past her on my way out, stopping just long enough to lean in slightly, my voice quiet but firm. Hope you didn't have any big vacation plans, I murmured. You're going to need every penny, She didn't respond. She just stared ahead, jaw tight, hands clenched in her lap, as the world around her crumbled. The fallout was swift. News of the ruling spread through the neighborhood like wildfire, whispered from porch to porch, discussed in hushed voices at HOA meetings that no longer held any real authority. Within days, the board held an emergency vote, and Karen was removed as president. Some of her most loyal supporters, the ones who had blindly signed off on her schemes, resigned before they could be implicated in further lawsuits. The HOA, once a feared and oppressive force, was crumbling. But I wasn't done. With the massive settlement money, I purchased the vacant lot next to Karen's house, a lot that had sat untouched for years because of HOA restrictions. But now, with the HOA in shambles, I was free to do whatever I wanted. And what I wanted was to rebuild my orchard, bigger and better than before. Over the next few weeks, I brought in a team of landscapers, replanting trees twice as tall as the ones Karen had destroyed. The orchard flourished, stretching high enough to block Karen's windows on all sides, cutting off her view completely. The irony wasn't lost on the neighbors. The first time Karen stepped outside and saw what I was doing, her face turned a shade of red I'd never seen before. She stormed forward, her mouth already open to spew whatever toothless threats she had left, but the second she stepped onto the sidewalk, she froze. A news crew stood just across the street, cameras rolling, capturing every second of my orchard's revival. Karen's nostrils flared, her hands trembled with rage, but she knew, if she made a scene now, it would be caught on film. For the first time, she had no power. A week later, I hosted a grand opening event for my new orchard. The entire neighborhood came, food, drinks, music, baskets of fresh fruit handed out for free. The laughter, the chatter, the warmth, it was everything Karen had tried to erase. She, of course, stayed inside, blinds drawn, probably seething at the sound of people enjoying themselves right outside her door. Not long after, she put her house on the market. With her reputation in ruins and her control completely gone, she didn't stand a chance of regaining her grip on the neighborhood. She left quietly, without a word, vanishing into the past like a bad memory. The HOA, stripped of its power, became little more than a casual neighborhood committee. The ridiculous fines, the overreaching rules, the iron-fisted control, all gone. As I stood beneath the shade of my newly planted trees, watching the golden light of sunset filter through the branches, a neighbor approached me, biting into a fresh apple. He grinned. "I guess you won, huh?" I took a deep breath, feeling the air clean and crisp, filled with the scent of new life growing where destruction once reigned. "I didn't just win," I said, watching as the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the orchard. "I made sure she lost. And in the end, that was the best revenge of all." Have you ever felt powerless against HOA, or a Karen, in your life? Share your experiences below. Let's see who had it worse.